Greetings, fellow gamers. Welcome back. It is I, Eric's UK, with another games I have played sort of chat. A couple of weeks ago, I started with Vampire the Masquerade, and I thought, well, let's go through the other World of Darkness games that I've done. I did Vampire the Requiem, which is the newer version. But today we're going to talk about Werewolf the Apocalypse, which was the second game in the original World of Darkness series. And as I'm sure you can guess by the name, you played werewolves. And this was probably my least favourite of the World of Darkness games. Vampire the Masquerade had a very... well... if you've seen that video, you know I had trouble with it originally, but once you get the hang of it, had a very detailed sort of setting that didn't gel too far. No, that's not the right word. It didn't change too much about what you thought of vampires. And the setting was pretty much what you can think, Hollywood vampire movies, anything like that. Werewolf the Apocalypse was very odd. It used the same world, but werewolves weren't werewolves as you and I might understand them. Obviously, they are people that shapeshift into giant man monsters. But we tend to view them as, I think, like vampires, very Eastern European lore. They're the sort of thing that stalk forests, and it's a curse on people that forces them to transform into these creatures and go killing. In Werewolf the Apocalypse, there were tribes of werewolves, and it was like their race. They weren't human, they just looked it 9 times out of 10. And they could transform into a bigger, more grisly human, or they could become a wolf, or they could become the great big monster that we know of. And it was very much, well, I would say very much, I'm probably saying the wrong thing here, but I would say it was very much, one moment, there is a cat wanting to go out. Sorry about that. It's a dark and windy, rainy night, and the cat decides she wants to go out partway through my video. Typical. Where was I saying? Oh, yes. I kind of get the impression that it was kind of trying to build on the idea of sort of like Native American spiritual mythology, spiritualism. It's very hard to explain that really, but there you go. And in a way, that kind of works. I see that. Except what they've done with it is they've made... They're not like vampires. They're not creatures that prey on people. They don't like humans, but they don't like humans because humans are destructive to the environment. It's a very green sort of game. It's very odd. And essentially the idea is that the world is falling apart. It's fallen into this world of darkness, to this gothic sort of horror, because there are 3 spiritual entities. A triad, I think. I can't remember what one was called. One was like the Weaver, one was the Worm, and one was something else. But the Worm basically had become corrupted in some fashion, and that was what was taught, become the force of evil, if you were. And it was corrupting people. It was trying to destroy everything else, and it was doing that through human greed and selfishness, and it even led to the formation. The main villain, if that's the word in Werewolf the Apocalypse, was a corporation called Pentex. And they were all about making... It was really bizarre. It was all about... well, on one hand, you had things like chemical dumping and rubbish and destruction of the environment. On the other hand, you had them putting, like, plague spirits into children's toys, and the sort of dolls that ooze goo. They would use that, and the goo would be infested with spirits of the worm to corrupt children's minds. and you kind of read through it, you just went, what the heck are they playing at? They could have done something really cool here, and instead they did this. And this is why I don't think I ever really got into it. A friend of mine, one of my vampire players, a nice guy called Paulie, he really got into Werewolf for some reason. And the only time I used it in Vampire basically to have some werewolf stats. Didn't use the actual background thing. But Paulie actually did run a very short Chronicle. There was the city book. I want to call it Vancouver Dark Alliance. It's late. My memory is not what it was. And that was the idea of that was it was a city with a vampire and a werewolf population, because the two don't get on. Werewolves always saw vampires as basically people corrupted by the worm. They were a corruption of humanity. But this was a really weird thing, and my friend Jason played in this Chronicle. It was just the two of us, kind of like two players and a storyteller. And I remember we had a very bizarre Chronicle. We tried to make the best of it. He decided he wanted to play a vampire from the vampire side of it. So he played a Nosferatu, an ancient, an elder, who was originally a Mongol and wielded a great big sword and called himself the Kurgan. I wonder where he got that idea from. Whereas I decided that werewolves weren't my cup of tea, but they did do a source book for one of the werewolf kin type things called a Mokoli, which was a were alligator. And they did this really weird thing in that book where you could, based on a stat called Gnosis, you could alter what would have been your big werewolf form, your Krynos form. And you could manipulate how you came out of it. And I actually worked out with like 4 or 5 points, you could become bipedal. You could have razor claws on your hind feet, biting teeth, and I think something else. And I basically was a were-velociraptor. And in that setting, Mokoli are they don't like people and they tend to eat them. So the Kurgan used to go around, kill people or drain their blood, and then my character would just eat the body and leave very little left behind as evidence. It's very bizarre. But this was the sort of game that Werewolf was. It didn't really, for me, work all that well. It didn't fit with it's supposed to, all the World of Darkness games are supposed to fit into the same world. They are the same world. But Werewolf was the one that never really worked, in my mind. It was just too odd and out there. If they'd have tried to make it something akin to, I suppose, like Vampire. With Vampire, you could tell where these ideas had come from, the Bram Stoker style of things, or Anne Rice, or they were still vampires as we would understand them. But werewolves in Apocalypse were almost nothing like traditional legendary werewolves. And I know it had quite a following, same as Vampire did, but I just never got it myself. And they did another one for the second World of Darkness. I think it was called Werewolf the Forsaken, but I never touched that. I was never interested, so I don't know how they changed them in that. Anyway, that was just a slightly longer than expected video. Just my thoughts on that particular game that I partly used as GM material and briefly, oddly played. Have you had any experience with playing Werewolf the Apocalypse, or even Forsaken, if that's what it was called? I would love to know. You drop it down into the comments below or do me a vid. That would be great. Until then, take care guys, and good gaming.